My dad said, "Family comes first," when I caught him selling my diabetic sister's insulin. That night, I found his dealer's phone number written on her medical alert bracelet. I was 15 when I first realized something was wrong with how Dad was handling Mia's diabetes supplies. She was 12 and had been type 1 diabetic since she was 8, so we all knew the routine by heart. Monthly pharmacy pickups, careful insulin storage in the fridge, checking expiration dates, keeping emergency glucose tablets everywhere. But lately, Mia had been asking for her emergency kit more often, saying she felt shaky and dizzy during school. I figured her blood sugar was just harder to control as she got older, since that's what the doctor had warned us about during puberty. What I didn't know was that Dad had been systematically stealing her medication for months. The first red flag came when I was getting juice from the kitchen fridge and noticed we only had 2 insulin pens left when we should have had at least 8 from the monthly refill Dad picked up 3 days earlier. The pharmacy receipt was still on the counter showing he'd collected a full month's supply, but most of it had already disappeared. I asked him about it while he was making coffee, and he said Mia had been going through it faster lately because of growth spurts affecting her blood sugar levels. He seemed annoyed that I was even asking, like I was questioning his ability to manage his own daughter's medical care. When I suggested we call her endocrinologist to discuss the increased usage, he shut me down completely and said, "Doctors just want to sell more expensive medications." Over the next week, I started paying closer attention to Mia's daily routine and noticed she was checking her blood sugar obsessively, sometimes every hour instead of the normal 4 times per day. Her glucose meter readings were all over the place, spiking dangerously high, then crashing low within hours. When I asked if she was taking her insulin on schedule, she said yes, but looked confused about why her numbers were so unstable. She'd been feeling sick most afternoons, complaining of headaches and fatigue that made it hard to concentrate in school. I suggested she talk to Dad about maybe needing dosage adjustments, but she said he told her it was normal teenage stuff and that she was being dramatic about minor symptoms. The breaking point came on a Thursday when Mia collapsed during PE class and had to be rushed to the school nurse. Her blood sugar was over 400, which is dangerous diabetic ketoacidosis territory that can cause coma or death. The nurse called Dad immediately and demanded he bring insulin to the school right away. He showed up an hour later with a single pen that was nearly empty, claiming it was all we had left at home until the next pharmacy run. The nurse looked suspicious and asked when he'd last picked up her prescription, but Dad got defensive and said he knew how to manage his daughter's condition without interference from school employees who didn't understand the complexities of pediatric diabetes. That night, I decided to check our medicine cabinet myself while Dad was out at what he called his AA meeting, though I'd started noticing he came back from these meetings smelling like cigarettes and acting more agitated than relaxed. Inside the diabetes supply box, I found mostly empty insulin pens, expired glucose tablets, and blood testing strips that had been repackaged in unmarked containers. The prescription bottles were there, but when I checked the dates, they showed refills that should have lasted weeks were being picked up every few days. Either Mia was using 10 times more insulin than prescribed, or something was seriously wrong with how Dad was managing her medication supply. I took pictures of everything with my phone before putting it all back exactly how I found it. The next morning, I confronted Dad directly about the missing insulin and showed him the photos I'd taken. His face went red, and he started yelling about me snooping through private medical supplies and violating family privacy. He said Mia's diabetes was more complicated than I understood, and that he was working with her doctors to adjust her treatment plan. When I asked why her blood sugars were so unstable if everything was under control, he claimed teenage hormones made diabetes management unpredictable. He warned me against spreading panic in the family over normal medical fluctuations that would resolve themselves with time and proper parental supervision. I told him that what I'd witnessed wasn't normal medical management, and that Mia could die if she wasn't getting proper insulin doses. His expression hardened, and he moved closer until he was towering over me in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. He reminded me that he was her father and legal guardian, responsible for all medical decisions until she turned 18. Perhaps I was jealous of the attention Mia's condition required, he suggested, or maybe I was confused about medical care because I'd never had to manage a chronic illness myself. Family business stayed in the family, he emphasized, and outside interference could destroy everything we'd built together since Mom died 2 years ago. The conversation ended with him warning me to be very careful about making accusations against my own father based on nothing more than teenage misunderstanding of complex medical situations. False allegations had consequences, he emphasized, and I needed to think seriously about whether I wanted to be responsible for breaking up our family because of my own confusion. He sat back down and returned to his newspaper like our conversation had never happened, dismissing me with the kind of cold indifference that made it clear he wasn't worried about my threats or my knowledge of Mia's deteriorating condition. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to convince Dad to properly manage Mia's diabetes, I started documenting evidence of her medical neglect myself. I began taking photos of her blood sugar readings, noting the times she felt sick or dizzy, recording when she asked for emergency glucose because her insulin wasn't working properly. I photographed the nearly empty medicine cabinet and created a timeline of her symptoms that clearly showed a pattern of inadequate medical care. Most importantly, I started hiding backup supplies of insulin and glucose tablets in my own room, stealing small amounts from Dad's stash before he could sell them or trade them away. 3 days into my surveillance, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While searching Dad's room for evidence of where the missing insulin was going, I found text messages on his phone between him and someone named Rico discussing trades of medical supplies for what they called party favors. The messages showed Dad had been selling Mia's insulin pens for $50 each to buy cocaine, methamphetamine, and prescription painkillers for himself. He was literally choosing drugs over his diabetic daughter's life, trading medication that kept her alive for substances that satisfied his own addiction. The messages went back months, showing this wasn't a recent desperate decision, but a calculated ongoing business arrangement. I spent hours going through his phone while he was passed out on the couch, finding correspondence with multiple dealers who specialized in trading stolen prescription medications. Dad had been systematically selling not just Mia's insulin, but also her glucose testing strips, emergency glucagon kits, and even her prescription for glucose tablets. The evidence showed he'd been doing this for at least 6 months, gradually increasing the frequency as his drug habit grew more expensive. Some of the messages discussed other diabetic kids whose families he could exploit for their medication supplies, treating children's life-saving prescriptions like inventory in a drug trafficking operation. The most chilling discovery came when I found photos on his phone of Mia during her worst blood sugar episodes, unconscious or barely responsive, with timestamps showing he'd taken pictures instead of helping her. These weren't concerned parent documentation, but rather sick trophies of his daughter's suffering that he could use to manipulate sympathy from dealers or social services if anyone questioned his parenting. He'd been documenting her medical crises not to seek treatment, but to create evidence that he could use to explain away her declining health as natural disease progression rather than deliberate neglect. One particularly disturbing message thread showed Dad bragging to Rico about how easy it was to manipulate a diabetic kid's medication schedule to create artificial emergencies that justified frequent pharmacy visits. He described diluting her insulin with saline to make it last longer while still appearing to give her proper doses, a practice that could have killed her during a severe hyperglycemic episode. Another conversation detailed how he'd been crushing her glucose tablets and cutting them with baking soda to stretch the supply, essentially giving her placebos during low blood sugar emergencies when she desperately needed real medication. Armed with this information, I knew I had to act immediately to save Mia's life, but first, I needed to make sure she understood what was happening to her and why her diabetes had become so unmanageable. That evening, I sat her down in my room and explained that Dad had been selling her insulin instead of giving it to her, which was why her blood sugar numbers were so chaotic. She initially didn't believe me, insisting Dad would never hurt her intentionally, but when I showed her the text messages and photos from his phone, she broke down crying and admitted she'd suspected something was wrong, but was too scared to say anything because Dad got angry whenever she questioned his medical decisions. Mia told me things I hadn't known about Dad's behavior when I wasn't around. He'd been forcing her to skip insulin doses some days, claiming she was becoming too dependent on medication and needed to build natural tolerance. He made her exercise intensively without proper blood sugar monitoring, saying physical activity was better than drugs for controlling diabetes. When she complained of feeling sick, he'd accuse her of being weak and dramatic, threatening to tell her teachers and friends that she was using her medical condition for attention. He'd even hidden her glucose meter for days at a time, claiming she was obsessing over numbers instead of learning to listen to her body's natural signals. The manipulation went deeper than just medication theft. Dad had been isolating Mia from her medical team by canceling appointments and lying about the reasons, telling her endocrinologist's office that she was doing well and didn't need frequent monitoring. He'd intercepted calls from her doctors and school nurse, pretending to be responsive to their concerns while privately berating Mia for causing problems that might expose his criminal activity. He convinced her that medical professionals were trying to overmedicate her for profit and that he was protecting her from unnecessary interventions that would make her sicker in the long run. The psychological abuse was just as damaging as the medical neglect. Dad had trained Mia to believe that her symptoms were character flaws rather than treatable medical conditions, making her ashamed of needing insulin and glucose monitoring to survive. He told her that strong people don't depend on medications and that she was choosing to be sick because it was easier than taking responsibility for her own health. When she had severe hypoglycemic episodes that left her confused and shaking, he'd mock her for being dramatic and demand she perform normal activities to prove she wasn't really that sick. As I listened to Mia describe months of this systematic abuse, I realized Dad hadn't just been stealing her medication for drug money, he'd been deliberately torturing her with medical neglect while convincing her it was for her own good. The cruelty was so calculated and sustained that it went far beyond addiction-driven desperation into something that looked more like sadistic pleasure in watching his own daughter suffer. Every time she'd tried to advocate for her medical needs, he'd punished her with shame, isolation, and escalated neglect that made her afraid to speak up about life-threatening symptoms. The next morning, instead of going to school, I walked directly to the police station with printouts of every message, photo, and document I'd found on Dad's phone. My hands shook as I approached the front desk, and asked to speak with someone about child endangerment and medical neglect. The officer who interviewed me was a middle-aged woman named Detective Rivera, who listened to my story with growing alarm, examining each piece of evidence while taking detailed notes about Dad's drug-dealing operation and systematic abuse of Mia's medical condition. Her expression grew darker with each document I showed her, especially the photos of Mia unconscious during medical crises that Dad had photographed instead of treating. Detective Rivera explained that what I documented constituted multiple felonies, including child endangerment, prescription fraud, drug trafficking, and potentially attempted murder depending on how severe Mia's medical episodes had become. She said the evidence was some of the most comprehensive documentation of medical abuse she'd ever seen from a minor, and that my systematic approach to gathering proof would be crucial for prosecution. She thanked me for coming forward and assured me that both Mia and I would be protected during the investigation, which would likely involve emergency removal from our home and placement with relatives while charges were filed. The investigation moved rapidly once law enforcement became involved. Detective Rivera obtained emergency search warrants for our house, Dad's phone records, and coordination with narcotics officers who'd been tracking prescription drug trafficking in our area. She explained that Dad's operation was larger than just stealing from his own daughter, based on the dealer communications I'd uncovered, and that multiple families with chronically ill children were likely being exploited by his trafficking network. The case had potential federal implications because prescription fraud across state lines fell under DEA jurisdiction, meaning Dad could face decades in prison rather than just local charges. 2 days later, plainclothes officers arrived at our house during breakfast and arrested Dad while Mia and I watched from the kitchen table. The sight of him being handcuffed sent Mia into a panic attack that spiked her blood sugar to dangerous levels, requiring immediate medical attention that finally came from people who actually wanted to help her. Detective Rivera stayed with us while paramedics checked Mia's condition and assured us that we'd never have to worry about Dad controlling her medical care again. She explained that we'd be placed with family members who could provide proper medical management while the legal case proceeded. The search of our house revealed Dad's entire drug stash hidden behind a false wall in the basement, along with stolen insulin pens from at least 6 different families whose diabetic children he'd been exploiting through various schemes. He'd convinced other parents to sell him their kids extra supplies during financial emergencies, then resold everything to dealers for 3 times the profit. The evidence showed he'd been running a sophisticated operation that put dozens of diabetic children at risk by creating artificial shortages of life-saving medication in our community. Police found detailed customer lists, pricing charts, and expansion plans that treated pediatric medical supplies like any other criminal commodity. One of the most disturbing discoveries was Dad's recruiting notebook, where he'd documented vulnerable families with diabetic children that he could potentially exploit. He'd attended diabetes support groups and online forums not to help Mia, but to identify other desperate parents who might be convinced to sell their children's medication during financial crises. His notes included details about each family's financial situation, their child's medication regimen, and psychological profiles of which parents might be susceptible to his manipulation tactics. He'd essentially turned pediatric medical support networks into hunting grounds for finding new victims. Within 48 hours, Mia and I were placed with our Aunt Carol, who was a registered nurse and immediately took control of properly managing Mia's diabetes care. For the first time in months, Mia had consistent insulin doses, regular meal timing, and proper blood sugar monitoring that brought her numbers back into healthy ranges. The relief on her face when she realized she could trust her medication again was heartbreaking, knowing she'd been suffering for so long while Dad prioritized his addiction over her survival. Aunt Carol had to completely restart Mia's treatment plan because Dad's medication tampering had made it impossible to determine her actual insulin needs. The medical evaluation that Aunt Carol arranged revealed the full extent of damage Dad had inflicted on Mia's health over the past 6 months. Her A1C levels showed extremely poor blood sugar control that had put her at risk for diabetic complications typically seen in adults who'd had uncontrolled diabetes for decades. She had early signs of diabetic neuropathy in her feet, kidney function changes that suggested diabetic nephropathy, and retinal changes that could progress to vision loss if not carefully monitored. These were preventable complications that occurred because Dad had deliberately withheld proper medical care from a child whose life depended on consistent treatment. Beyond the physical damage, Mia showed signs of complex medical trauma that required intensive psychological intervention. She was afraid to take insulin without multiple adults confirming it was safe, terrified that any medication might be diluted or contaminated like Dad had been giving her. She obsessively checked her blood sugar every few minutes, panicked when glucose readings weren't perfect, and had nightmares about diabetic comas that woke her up screaming. The trust between patient and caregiver that's essential for managing chronic illness had been completely destroyed by Dad's systematic abuse and would take years of therapy to rebuild. The local news picked up Dad's arrest story within a week, reporting that a father had been charged with trafficking his diabetic daughter's medication to fund a drug operation that exploited multiple families with chronically ill children. While they protected our identities due to our ages, they provided enough details about the case that our community understood how prescription drug theft was endangering vulnerable kids throughout our area. The article mentioned that the investigation had begun when a concerned family member came forward with extensive documentation, though my role remained anonymous throughout the initial media coverage. As more details emerged during Dad's preliminary hearings, the scope of his criminal enterprise became clear to prosecutors and the community. He'd been specifically targeting families with diabetic children because insulin is expensive and in constant demand among dealers who resell it to diabetic addicts who can't afford legitimate prescriptions. He'd joined multiple online support groups for parents of diabetic kids, befriended struggling families through social media, then gradually convinced them to sell their children's extra supplies during financial crises. The manipulation was systematic and predatory, designed to exploit both parental desperation and children's medical vulnerability for maximum profit. The federal investigation revealed connections between Dad's operation and a larger prescription trafficking network that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of criminals who specialized in different types of medical fraud. Dad's role was specifically recruiting families with diabetic children and coordinating the supply chain that moved stolen insulin from pediatric patients to adult addicts who paid premium prices for medication they couldn't obtain legally. His detailed records helped federal agents map the entire network and identify other recruitment specialists who were targeting families with different chronic conditions. Court documents showed that Dad had been planning to expand his operation by recruiting other parents to become sub-distributors, essentially franchising his model of exploiting chronically ill children for prescription trafficking. He'd developed training materials that taught desperate parents how to dilute their children's medications to create surplus inventory, how to manipulate medical appointments to justify frequent prescription refills, and how to identify other vulnerable families who could be brought into the network. The business plan treated children's life-threatening medical conditions as renewable resources that could be harvested indefinitely for profit. For Mia, the healing process involved not just physical recovery from months of inadequate diabetes management, but also intensive psychological therapy to process the trauma of realizing her own father had been systematically torturing her for drug money. She required specialized counseling from therapists who understood both medical trauma and child abuse, working through the complex feelings of betrayal, self-blame, and fear that made it difficult to trust any adult caregiver. Her diabetes management became intertwined with PTSD symptoms that made routine medical care triggering and emotionally overwhelming. The criminal case against Dad moved quickly once federal prosecutors took over from local authorities. Detective Rivera's initial investigation had been so thorough that federal agents could immediately begin tracing the broader network of prescription traffickers and corrupt medical professionals who'd been facilitating Dad's operation. His phone records led to arrests in 4 states, with dozens of families discovering that their children's medical supplies had been compromised by criminals who'd infiltrated diabetes support communities specifically to exploit vulnerable kids. Dad's defense attorney attempted to argue that addiction had impaired his judgment and that he hadn't intended to harm Mia, but the prosecution's evidence showed months of calculated planning and systematic escalation of abuse that went far beyond impaired decision-making. The photos of Mia unconscious during medical crises, the detailed business plans for expanding his trafficking operation, and the psychological manipulation tactics he'd used to isolate her from medical care demonstrated clear intent to cause harm for personal profit. The judge rejected any suggestion that addiction excused the deliberate endangerment of multiple children. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence against Dad was a recording found on his phone where he'd described to another trafficker how to maximize profit by gradually reducing diabetic children's medication doses until they were receiving just enough to prevent immediate death, but not enough to prevent long-term complications. He'd laughed while explaining how parents could be convinced that their children's declining health was natural disease progression rather than deliberate medical sabotage, ensuring a steady supply of desperate customers who would pay premium prices for black market insulin. The prosecution also revealed that Dad had been documenting his abuse of Mia not just for personal entertainment, but to create instructional materials for other traffickers who wanted to exploit their own children's medical conditions. He'd been developing a how-to guide for medical abuse that included step-by-step instructions for diluting medications, manipulating symptoms to justify prescription increases, and psychologically conditioning children to accept medical neglect as normal parental behavior. The systematic nature of his documentation showed this wasn't desperate addiction behavior, but calculated criminal enterprise. Federal sentencing guidelines for prescription trafficking involving minors carried mandatory minimum sentences that Dad couldn't avoid through plea bargaining, especially given the aggravating factors of child abuse and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. His attorney's attempts to negotiate reduced charges were rejected by prosecutors who had sufficient evidence to pursue the maximum penalties available under federal law. The case became a priority for the DEA's operation, targeting prescription trafficking networks that specifically exploited children with chronic medical conditions. As the legal proceedings continued, more families came forward with stories about Dad's recruitment tactics and the systematic way he'd infiltrated diabetes support communities to identify potential victims. Parents described how he'd gained their trust by appearing to be a knowledgeable and caring father dealing with the same challenges they faced, gradually introducing the idea of selling excess medication as a way to offset the crushing financial burden of pediatric diabetes care. His manipulation had been so skillful that several families had trusted him with their children's medical information and emergency contacts. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Dad had been planning to recruit Mia as an active participant in his trafficking operation once she turned 16, teaching her to identify and manipulate other diabetic teenagers who might be convinced to sell their own medication. Court documents showed detailed plans for using Mia's medical condition and personal relationships to expand his network into high schools and youth diabetes programs, essentially turning her into an unwitting accomplice in the exploitation of her own peer group. Medical experts who testified during the federal proceedings explained the long-term health consequences of Dad's systematic medication tampering and how his actions had essentially given Mia a different, more severe form of diabetes through deliberate medical sabotage. The controlled substances he'd mixed with her insulin created unpredictable absorption rates that made blood sugar management nearly impossible, while the psychological trauma had triggered stress responses that physiologically worsened her insulin resistance. His abuse had literally changed the nature of her medical condition in ways that would require lifelong specialized care. The case attracted national attention when pediatric endocrinologists began publishing research about prescription trafficking that specifically targeted diabetic children, using Dad's operation as a case study in how criminal networks exploit medical vulnerability. Their findings showed that families dealing with chronic childhood illnesses were being systematically targeted by traffickers who understood that desperate parents might be convinced to compromise their children's medical care during financial emergencies, creating a new category of child abuse that medical professionals needed to be trained to recognize. Support groups for families affected by prescription trafficking began forming in communities where Dad's network had operated, bringing together parents who discovered their children's medical care had been compromised by criminals they'd trusted. These families faced unique challenges in rebuilding trust with medical providers and helping their children recover from the trauma of having their life-saving medications deliberately withheld or tampered with by people who were supposed to protect them. The psychological impact on Mia extended beyond typical medical trauma to include complex feelings about her own identity as a diabetic person and whether she could ever trust her perception of her own medical needs. Dad's systematic gaslighting had convinced her that many of her symptoms were imaginary or exaggerated, making it difficult for her to advocate for herself with new caregivers who actually wanted to help her. She required specialized therapy that addressed both medical trauma and the specific forms of psychological abuse used by traffickers to maintain control over their victims. 18 months after Dad's arrest, the full scope of his criminal network had been mapped by federal investigators who'd identified over 200 families whose children had been directly or indirectly affected by prescription trafficking operations in our region. The investigation had led to reforms in how medical support groups verified member identities and new protocols for detecting when children's medication regimens showed signs of external tampering. Mia's case had become the foundation for training programs that taught medical professionals to recognize signs of prescription trafficking involving pediatric patients. The federal judge who sentenced Dad to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole described his crimes as representing a new category of child abuse that specifically exploited medical vulnerability for profit. The sentence included restitution payments to cover Mia's ongoing medical expenses and mandated participation in research studies that would help medical professionals better understand and prevent similar cases of systematic medical abuse. Dad showed no remorse during sentencing, maintaining that he'd been trying to help families who couldn't afford proper medical care. For our family, Dad's conviction provided legal closure, but couldn't undo the permanent changes his abuse had caused in Mia's health and psychological well-being. Her diabetes would require more intensive management for the rest of her life due to the complications he'd caused, and she'd need ongoing therapy to process the complex trauma of surviving systematic medical abuse by her own father. The financial settlement from the federal case would help cover these costs, but couldn't restore the childhood innocence that Dad had destroyed through his calculated exploitation of her medical condition. My decision to document evidence and report Dad's crimes had prevented Mia's death and exposed a prescription trafficking network that was endangering hundreds of chronically ill children throughout our region. Detective Rivera credited my systematic approach to gathering evidence with making the federal case possible and potentially saving dozens of other kids from similar abuse. The knowledge that my actions had protected vulnerable children helped me process the complicated feelings about destroying my own family to save my sister's life, though the emotional cost of that choice would take years to fully understand. The experience fundamentally changed how I understood family loyalty, parental authority, and the responsibility to protect vulnerable people, even when they're being harmed by people who claim to love them. It taught me that sometimes love requires breaking the systems that enable abuse, even when those systems are families and the abusers are parents. The case became a catalyst for legal reforms and medical training programs that hopefully prevented other children from experiencing the systematic medical abuse that Dad had inflicted on Mia and countless other victims. Looking back, I realized that Dad's addiction hadn't made him into an abuser. It had simply provided the motivation for abuse that his fundamental character had always been capable of inflicting. The systematic nature of his exploitation, the pleasure he'd taken in documenting Mia's suffering, and his complete lack of remorse even after conviction showed that he'd used addiction as an excuse to justify cruelty he'd wanted to inflict, regardless of his substance use. Understanding this helped me reject the guilt I'd initially felt about reporting him and accept that protecting Mia had been the only moral choice available. The federal reforms that resulted from Dad's case included mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals who suspected prescription tampering, enhanced background checks for people working in pediatric healthcare settings, and new protocols for verifying the authenticity of medical support groups where vulnerable families might be targeted by traffickers. These changes were implemented nationwide and named after several child victims whose cases had helped expose the scope of prescription trafficking networks that specifically exploited chronically ill children. 3 years later, Mia had developed into a strong advocate for other kids with chronic medical conditions, speaking at conferences about recognizing and reporting medical abuse while managing her diabetes with the independence and confidence that Dad had tried to destroy. Her recovery demonstrated the resilience that children can show when they receive proper medical care and psychological support after surviving systematic abuse. She credited our bond as siblings with giving her the strength to trust new caregivers and rebuild her relationship with medical treatment. The long-term impact of exposing Dad's crimes extended beyond our family to influence how law enforcement, medical professionals, and support organizations approach the intersection of child abuse and prescription trafficking. Training programs based on Mia's case taught investigators to look for signs of medical abuse in trafficking cases and helped medical professionals understand how criminal networks exploit healthcare systems to harm the most vulnerable patients. The reforms potentially protected thousands of children from similar exploitation. For me, the experience shaped my career goals and my understanding of how systemic abuse operates within families and communities that appear normal on the surface. I chose to study medical social work with a focus on child protection, using the knowledge I'd gained from investigating Dad's crimes to help other young people recognize and report abuse that masquerades as medical care. The case taught me that protecting vulnerable people sometimes requires destroying the very relationships and institutions that claim to safeguard them. The civil lawsuits against the medical professionals and support organizations that had failed to detect Dad's trafficking network were settled for substantial amounts that funded research into prescription abuse and new prevention programs. These settlements acknowledged that systematic failures in oversight had enabled Dad's operation to continue for months, while Mia and other children suffered life-threatening medical neglect. The money couldn't undo the damage Dad had caused, but it supported efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma. 6 months later, Dad died in federal prison during a fight with another inmate who discovered he was serving time for abusing a diabetic child. Mia's A1C levels had stabilized in the normal range under proper medical care, though she'd need specialized monitoring for diabetes complications for the rest of her life. The federal task force created after his case had identified and shut down 12 prescription trafficking networks, specifically targeting families with chronically ill children. I graduated high school early and started college studying medical advocacy, determined to help other kids whose medical needs are being exploited by people who should protect them. Sometimes saving a life means accepting that some family bonds are too dangerous to preserve.